Is it a true story? Is old Pinhead a true story? It's fiction. But it's based on several stories woven into one story. Anybody who's been in the field of retardation in any way, shape, or form has seen the film Out of the Darkness, which was a clandestine film made inside the Nebraska State Institution for the Retarded, and showed how things really were. That people were sometimes chained to padded areas of the floor naked. People were often chained to beds that were filled with human refuse. If you were able to mobilate and do things, scrub floors, wash dishes, mow lawns, you were a slave of the institution, and they worked you and you didn't get paid for it. You got your meals and your board in your room, but you didn't get to make any life choices. Life in our state institutions was bad. There were several such films made of them, and I was raised in a town where there was such a place. And it certainly improved, and it's very improved today. And it was improved by the 60s and the 70s, and went through the institutionalization and everything else. But before that, it was like all the similar institutions that you've seen in those kind of films. I'm a person who's been involved with people who have retardation for most of my life. And what I wanted to do was write a novel through the eyes of someone who lived in such an institution, through the eyes of somebody who was a trustee, somebody who was a slave of the institution, who worked at the institution and lived at the institution, and it was like for them a concentration camp. I met such a fellow, several such fellows. In my town, there was a trustee that was allowed to come into town and go to the Assemblies of God Church, which I was attending at the time because I wanted to date Evelyn Olson, who was a member of the Assemblies of God Church. And so I met this fellow. He could do anything. He was just mildly retarded and had some physical involvements facially and things like that that made him unpleasant to observe. There was a fellow working on my grandparents' farm who worked there for years. We called him Uncle Charlie. And that's based a lot in the book, too. And he escaped from that institution out at the end of the road. My grandfather gave him a job. And a lot of it is his story. I used to volunteer at that institution, and I knew people who worked in that institution who told tales about the inside of that institution. And I was very involved in the 70s in the deinstitutionalization of America, especially the Beatrice State Home. I was for NCORE, the intake advisor. I would drive to the institution with a list and pick up people and bring them back to the city and move them into community-based programs. What I wanted to do was create what life was like inside a place like that. And so I chose the 40s, late 40s, early 50s, when they were terrible, for the setting. And while it takes place at the Cascade School for the Retarded in a small town called Perkins Prairie, the institution itself is based on 3 institutions. The one that was in Buckley, one that was in Seattle, it was called Fircrest, and the Beatrice State Home in Nebraska. So it's a compilation. And my main character, Charles Waters, is a combination of several people. Uncle Charlie on my grandfather's farm, Harold, whatever his last name was, who was the trustee that came to the Assemblies of God Church, and people I knew when I worked in such an institution while going to graduate school in Seattle. I worked at Fircrest. And the situation there was greatly improved by the time I went to work in an institution over the years when I volunteered at an institution in Buckley. But the institutionalization hadn't yet begun. And I saw some incredibly unhappy things happen to people inside that institution. So that's what the novel is based on. It's based on a guy who figures a way to get out. And it's a complicated story. And it isn't a very funny story, although there will be moments of lightness in it. And it's the story of a human being transcending. And that's why the cover is so wonderful, because it's taken from the inside of a cave looking out into the light. And my character actually spends some time in a cave. It's one of the tools he uses in his escape. So it's called Old Pinhead because that's what he was called. His head came to a slight point. And so they nicknamed him Old Pinhead, even though he wasn't old. He was a trustee, he was a slave, and he became a free man. And it's the story of how not only he managed to make that happen in his life, but how people in that little back-town community came to his assistance when he needed it most and helped him escape into the ethers. It was a story I couldn't help but write.